Humberto, tell me a few of the most charismatic people you can think of.
So for me, there's Tom Cruise.
So what's charismatic about Tom Cruise to you?
He's always full of vitality and life. And I know he said some wacky things because of Scientology, but if you put that aside, you can tell he is living. He is intense. He's not here to just like show up. He's here to play.
So when you see that energy, that attracts you?
Yeah, it's energetic, and it's energetic in his performances. So there's hardly a movie that he's in that is not at least interesting because he's in it. And he just owns those performances. He can be accused of like he's always Tom Cruise, but it's entertaining. It's entertaining to watch.
And you can imagine he walks into a party and he's just chilling. You can imagine even if people didn't know who he was, like for some reason, no one knows who Tom Cruise, the celebrity, is.
Right.
You can imagine him being the life of the party.
Absolutely.
Just based on his personality.
And it might be a superficial life of the party, but I could see it.
Yeah.
In fact, that's a little bit of what I also see as the glibness. There is a glibness to his thing, but it's certainly like if he shows up at a party, everyone's paying attention.
Right. When I Google like most charismatic people, we got Adolf Hitler, very charismatic. Yes. He's known for his charisma.
Yeah.
We got Jim Jones, religious leader who took everyone down to South America and asked everyone, and to some extent coerced and forced everyone to complete suicide. Princess Diana, very charismatic, lots of eyes on her, lots of tabloids. I think that's another thing to look at is like, how much do the tabloids pay attention to that person? I think that's another potential indication of charisma, also just potential indication of like your salaciousness of your story or something.
Right.
Oprah Winfrey, very charismatic. You absolutely have to imagine that before she was famous, when she walked into a room, she owned that room. You have to imagine that when she talked to you, you felt like, whoa, this person really is intense and has a lot of excellent questions and is, interested and has a lot of different things to say. Gandhi moved an entire country, Kanye, very magnetic personality. There's a lot of rappers. That's the one thing you think of is like, there's hundreds of other, or at least dozens of other hip hop artists who had similar success on the charts.
Right.
What is it about Kanye? I mean, obviously Kanye had a lot more hits in strung over the span of 10 years or something. But there's been other artists like that who had similar success but not nearly as much press, attention. Ronald Reagan, very charismatic person. He was an actor and then governor and then president. Kim Kardashian, she's actually interesting because she doesn't have any particular talent, right? She's not a singer. She's not a basketball player. She can't act, really.
Yeah, I don't know much about her. I mean, I know that she's famous and she's got her show and all the people in her life are now making lots and lots of money. But
yeah, but it's just something about her. Obviously, the way she looks is a part of that, but there's a lot of women who look like her, in that category. Sure. So there's something about the way she holds herself, the way she talks, the way she looks at people. There's got to be there's a special something that I think Kim Kardashian probably had. Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, Jennifer Aniston, I think is another person like that. Jennifer Aniston, when she is in an interview on Jimmy Kimmel or something, there's just something compelling about her. You just want to listen to her. You just want to know what's happening for her. Donald Trump, obviously, Jay-Z, Elizabeth Holmes, which we talked about. Paris Hilton, I thought was another person kind of similar to Kim Kardashian, and then it's like there's a lot of rich, socialites. What is it about Paris Hilton that sort of elevated her? I mean, part of it's being in the right place, right time, but I think another part of it is people just have that special something. Yep. Paul Rudd, I just watched his Hot Ones video where he did the
dab,
the hot wings. And man, is that guy dripping with charisma.
He's great.
Just a lovable guy.
But it feels like you could say this about basically any human that rises above a certain level of notoriety within their grouping is by definition charismatic.
Yeah. And that's a question that we'll get into. What is the definition of charisma exactly? Is it just the fact that you're famous.
Yeah.
Because I don't think that's true. You know, you can be famous for a lot of reasons.
Well, sir, I don't mean famous just and then like, oh yeah, I know about that person because he fell off a building. I mean that it is in fact your persona that is the famous part.
Right.
Because you're either an athlete, an actor, and not necessarily an athlete, but like a public icon, you know. And so if your fame is directly correlated to your act.
Well, we'll get into that because at first I thought there wouldn't be a way to really discuss this. People have asked us to talk about this occasionally. And at first I was like, well, what are you going to say? It just seems like a amorphous conversation about opinion. Mm-hmm. But actually there's a ton of research literature on this topic that we're going to get into. Some other people that people suggested on Facebook, famous patron Lennon, who actually suggested us doing this episode, said Harrison Ford in Indy and Star Wars. Megan on Facebook said Elizabeth Warren. Maete said Will Smith. Joe on Facebook said me, which is hilarious. My mom said Michelle Obama. Mm-hmm. Jesse said Barack Obama. For Satis said Marlon Brando. And Jed said Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders. I deleted the D on his name, so I thought his name was Jay. So the question is, you know, let me ask you, Berto, these people who, you know, one could say that charisma's in the eye of the beholder. You know it when you see it, right? Mm-hmm. Your Will Smiths, your Kim Kardashians, your Bill Clintons, your Princess Di's. These are people that have a special something. How are they different from the rest of us? You know, what is the difference? If you were to measure it somehow or put some kind of label to it, what is the difference?
So let me start by saying, first of all, it definitely literally is in the eye of the beholder. And it's just that if it's in enough eyes of the beholders, that propels that person past the point where we say, ooh, that person's got a special something. Because when it's just like, you know, 0.01% of the population thinks someone is particularly interesting, then we won't all really label them that way. Even if those people swear by their opinion, right?
So you're saying that a big factor in whether or not someone is identified as charismatic is how many people are essentially paying attention to them.
Yeah, there's some critical mass.
Okay, what else?
And then, you know, essentially, I think that there are things they must do that resonate with large enough number of people. And so the things that they've got to do, it can be like they were in a movie that was great, or they were in a sport and really succeeded. Like, in other words, I don't think you can be perceived as truly charismatic if you didn't also like succeed at something. And that
Kim Kardashian, she had a sex tape.
Yeah, but that's not what propelled her to the fame she's got now. It was the show.
Okay.
The show is what made her. In fact, a lot of people poo-pooed the idea that she would have any fame because it was just based on the tape.
Right.
But then, and that kind of goes to show, no one would have said, asked, do you think Kim Kardashian is charismatic around that time? I think most people would have said, no, she's just famous because of a sex tape. But now, a lot of people would say, yeah. And it's because she did this show that everyone liked. Well, not everyone, but
she sustained. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And that's important to point out is that you look at Kim, you're like, oh, she just stands around looking pretty and, you know, people pay attention. But it's much more complicated than that. I mean, the amount of business choices that this family makes and the producers make all compels the charismatic viewpoint.
As a counterexample, imagine someone that's in the, let's take the chess world. And this guy, man, whenever you put a camera on him, he just speaks so smoothly and he's got aggressive viewpoints and but he loses every single game. So I don't know, like, if he's going to do so well in the court of public opinion.
Well, so for football fans out there, Tim Tebow is actually a good example of this.
Okay.
I don't know if you remember Tim Tebow.
I do, a little bit.
He was the guy. He would
kneel or whatever.
Right.
Yeah.
He would pray.
Yeah.
And although a lot of football players pray, why was he such a focus? And he actually wasn't that good of a football player. He had his moments in college, and he had his moments in the NFL for sure. But when you add him up on the scheme of the best quarterbacks of the past 30 years, he's probably in the bottom third, really.
Yeah.
But there was something about him that was just very charismatic.
And he was playing on the NFL. Like,
But-
that's already rising to a level of...
But how many of us can remember quarterbacks that were playing in what year was that, 2005 or whatever it was?
Yeah.
Like there were 50 other quarterbacks, backups included, in the NFL. Why do we know him and his look? And why to this day, like, I'll get suggested videos on YouTube saying, watch another documentary about Tim Tebow. and I watch them sometimes.
I'm definitely not saying it is sufficient, but it is a requirement. In other words, I bet you that there are countless dudes that are kind of like the same personality as Tim Tebow,
right?
But they're not in the NFL, they're not in the NBA, they're not in anything famous, so they'll never be perceived by the masses as charismatic.
But one could argue that at that time in the NFL, there were other personalities that had similar qualities as Tim Tebow in that moment. What was it about Tim Tebow? What gave him that special something? Was it the circumstance? Obviously, yes, because he's in the NFL and blah, blah, blah. Was it something about his personality? And I think that's what famous patron Lyndon was wanting us to get into. Because another facet or way of looking at charisma or way of defining charisma is that person who isn't famous, who walks into a room and people just go, wow, that woman is charismatic. The way she holds herself,
right.
The way she talks. And she's not famous.
Yep.
And she doesn't have any particular talent, but she is magnetic. Or the guy at work who gets everyone to laugh at their jokes, and everyone just likes that person. And when that person stands up and says, I have an opinion, people listen more than they do to someone else. What is it about that person?
Sure. That's
not circumstance. That's not fame. There's something about the way that person holds themselves that makes them more charismatic.
Potentially. It's interesting because you can come up with counterexamples, and so maybe, counterexamples to maybe the naive notion. Because you could say, well, they have a loud, very present voice. They are probably tall. They're probably good looking. You can make a list, but then you can definitely find counterexamples for almost all of it.
Right. So when famous patron Lyndon requested this topic, originally I thought this was going to be a very floppy, speculative conversation, like undefinable. Some even define charisma on the internet as being a supernatural gift given by God, like Rasputin or Caesar or Jesus, as you mentioned, or a king or something. That's the way we actually used to see charisma, was like, well, the reason why Jesus had charisma was because he was the Son of God. Right. Or the reason why Rasputin had this charisma was because he was demon-possessed. There's that sort of notion. So I thought my field avoided the topic, and thus I avoided it. But after diving into the research literature, there's a lot of strong scientific inquiry into what makes some people charismatic as opposed to other people. There's a lot of disciplines that have actually looked into it. I've discovered psychology, management, because at work you're always interested in charisma, sociology, obviously, and political science, which is another one. There's been some notable seminal studies over the last number of years. Shamir et al. In 93, Conger and Kanungo in 1987, Uckel in 99, House et al. 1991, and Gardner Avolio in 1998. And these are just the seminal papers. And it's actually gaining prominence in my field, in sociology, social psychology. Berto, why do you think it's gaining prominence recently?
Because probably we live in such a celebrity culture, and we have celebrity politicians, and we have celebrity everythings.
Yeah. Something like 90% of people in my field are liberals. And when Trump became president, it was, a shock to the system for a lot of people in my field. And that shapes the sort of studies and also what tends to get published in journals as well. But even if we don't look at current trends, there's huge consequences to charisma if you frame it in a certain way. I mean, the way you're framing it is much more circumstantial, but what if there are certain qualities or even if there are circumstances, depending on who is elevated, our entire society and history can be altered, right? I mean, Hitler, for example. What if it wasn't Hitler? What if it was someone else? It's an interesting question. how do we notice the next Hitler? How do we notice the next Gandhi so we can elevate that person? Good and bad ways. But also, there's a lot of people who are like you and me on social media who have a vested interest in trying to be quote unquote charismatic, even though we wouldn't necessarily frame it that way. Mm-hmm. You can literally be a billionaire. I don't know how much PewDiePie owns, but it's got to be a lot of money, right?
Right.
Right? Doesn't he make...
Oh, yeah, he makes a ton of money.
Yeah. How much money do you think he has, like, in the bank?
Tens of millions.
Yeah. And he's just a dude in what? Is he German or Danish, or where is he from?
I think he's from here, right?
Oh,
Isn't he the States guy?
I thought he was PewDiePie.
Yeah, I think he's from the States.
I thought he was Swedish or something.
He
Anyway.
might descend, but I think he's a U.S. guy.
But anyway, he's just sitting in wherever he is, and he makes these videos online, which are apparently incredibly charismatic to people. And then once he actually got that platform, he actually started to voice his opinions and had a sway on people's belief systems and everything. So you can become a millionaire just based on your charisma alone.
Right.
Or a lot of people on the internet are interested in like how to get the girl, right?
Right. And
charisma is potentially a line to go down in terms of getting the girl or getting the promotion.
Right, right.
Also, leaders define our times. When you think about the Civil War, who do you think of?
Grant and Lincoln and
right.
The other bad guy.
You mean Lee or something?
Lee,
Robert E. Yeah, these were all reportedly very charismatic people. Abraham Lincoln apparently was very charismatic.
Right.
And so we can look into that. When we think of civil rights, who do you think of?
Martin Luther King and women, I forget the name of the woman, the suffrage. I don't come from this country, so I don't know all the history names.
Are you mixing suffrage with civil rights?
No, I said Martin Luther King. Oh, well, okay. You're saying just the 60s.
Yeah.
I kind of meant
civil rights movement.
The 20th century civil rights. But
yeah. When it's sort of bizarre because when you think about the Civil War involved hundreds of thousands of people.
Right.
And even if you just limit it to politicians, we're talking about hundreds of people. When you think about civil rights, again, millions of people.
Right.
And when you think about figures in civil rights in the 60s, we're talking about hundreds of people. Back then, Martin Luther King was just one of many figures. And what is it about Martin Luther King that makes us remember him? Right. He's the face of that movement when at the time he was a figure, but he wasn't the only one. But when you see him talk, when he gives his speeches, even just the way his face looks, really, the way he wears a suit, the way he walks around, there's just something magnetic about that guy.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, part of it could be simply deviations from the norm, and those deviations are paired with some sort of positive connotation. This is what I was saying, that I think there has to be something impressive that they did to go along with it.
Okay. Or at least perceived, right?
Right, because take Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is as far away from an orator as you could imagine, right? He looks all kind of sort of wimpy, and he doesn't look straight at you, and he talks with a very little voice like this. And so he's not what you would imagine is, oh, that's a charismatic dude right there. But somehow, I guarantee any room he ever walked into, people would turn and be like, oh my God, that's Michael Jackson. Now, is it because, chicken and egg, right? He was already a big singer with his family, and then he became even more famous. But clearly, he wore interesting things that no one else was wearing. He danced in a way that no one else was dancing. And he certainly sang in a way that no one else was singing.
And one could argue that his odd way of speaking and holding himself
was also a deviation.
Was actually charismatic, even though you wouldn't say, to be charismatic, have a really high voice, talk in a very shy fashion, and act like a 12-year-old.
And that's why I said deviation, not just strong voice, because you apply the same thing to others like Bjork or actually probably Gandhi. I don't remember the actual video, but I from what I know, Gandhi wasn't like a Hitler, in that he wasn't the pound the podium and yell from the ramparts, right? It was talk softly, carry a soft walking stick. You know,
talk softly and starve yourself.
yeah.
Actually, don't. It's been a while since I've seen footage of him in real life. Of course, it was back before there was a ton of footage of such things. But anyway,
or sorry, another counterexample to that narrative from Osama bin Laden, the videos that have surfaced of Osama bin Laden, who, as much as we may dislike him, clearly he was able to galvanize some people, right? And you watch these videos, and it's like this totally calm, passive speaking.
Great example. He's the definition of charisma. He got people to do things like kill themselves, or dedicate the rest of their lives through thick and thin and moving away from their homes, and to do terrible things, or to do extreme things.
Yeah,
and yet he wasn't, pounding the podium. Another depressing thought I thought of was like, 50 years from now, when they think of our time right now, who they're going to think of.
Certainly.
And it's like,
Alec Baldwin.
Berto, top 5 most charismatic people to you.
Yeah, so I mentioned Alec Baldwin. I think Alec Baldwin is very, very charismatic. I've seen him be charismatic in pretty much every movie and show he's ever been on.
Yeah, he has a podcast.
Oh, I didn't know that, actually.
Yeah.
That's probably amazingly entertaining.
This is a thing, and it's a great podcast.
Oh, I'll have to listen to it, because I've seen his interviews. I've seen him be just like on live things. But every single performance, the guy just gets hired to portray someone who commands respect.
Yeah.
Period. The way he talks, the way he walks, everything. So that guy is crazy charismatic.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you see him in Comedians getting in cars getting coffee?
No, I didn't see it.
Oh,
is it good?
It's okay, yeah.
The other one, I mentioned Tom Cruise. So you had asked me some questions. Like, the first one was, I believe almost everything they say. That's Alec Baldwin for me. Like, if Alec Baldwin's saying something, I'll be like, yeah, I believe it. know. And what comes to mind is his speech in Glen Ross. It's like, coffee is for closers. I'm like, all right, I believe it. And then the second one was, I want to watch them do almost anything. That to me is the Tom Cruise factor.
Okay.
Because he's just... forget his kooky outside of the movie things. Whenever you're watching him on an interview or on a movie or whatever, it's like, man, I can't look away. This is interesting.
Yeah.
Other ones, you asked me, I want to please them and obey them without question. That was my old Taekwondo sensei.
Wow.
He was, and I'm so sad because I sort of forgot his first name, but he was this great leader, and everything he would say, we'd do, and he just commanded an incredible amount of respect from all of us.
Okay.
And to this day, I think of it that way. And then I want to meet them and talk about stuff. Cenk Uygur from the Young Turks.
Oh.
I think he's very charismatic, and I would, yeah. And then lastly, I would have followed them off a cliff. No one.
Yeah. Oh, but is that 5?
That was 5. 1, 2, 3, 4. No one is the 5th one. But if you ask me,
well, give me yeah.
Okay, I'll give you Mr. Rogers.
Okay.
I think Mr. Rogers has that quiet charisma that was incredible.
Okay, for me, I would have followed them off a cliff. Again, it was hard for all of these are kind of mitigated by. I don't think Humberto and I are actually that susceptible to charismatic people. I think we're both skeptical of such things.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
We're both. We're both kind of leaders of ourselves, and
I tend to dislike, and I've always disliked cliques, and specifically the idea of a cultish attachment to anything.
Yeah,
I've always been grossed out by it.
Yeah, as a Seattle liberal, progressive liberal, the two of us, we have a tendency to fall in love with our liberal politicians just like anyone else does. And yet, you and I have no problem tearing apart our liberal politicians and being like, well, they fucked that one up.
Yep.
And that was bullshit. And, so whereas someone else who has a different kind of way of approaching life, it might be harder for them to do that. I think you and I are just really skeptical about that kind of stuff, for 2 different reasons. I mean, you grew up in a world in Colombia where charismatic leaders literally like destroyed your city.
Yeah. Talk about a charismatic drug dealers, right?
Right. And I grew up not in that world, but I just grew up, I think, in a way that I was encouraged to really think for myself, I think was the thing. But anyway, but if there was someone I was going to follow off a cliff, it would be Virginia Satir, who is a family therapist, pioneer. When you have to watch videos of her, when she talks, she's just tall. She's like, 6 foot.
Oh, wow.
Sort of grandma, slender, powerful talker. Everything she said, and just watching her in session, actually, she just has this way to like get people to do things that they would never do otherwise. And I imagine if I was hanging out with her, I would be very much wrapped up in her world. I believe almost everything they say. That's Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah, sure.
Malcolm Gladwell also has a podcast called Revisionist History, which I love. He just, now at the same time, when I listen to him talk, there are some times when I'm like, I don't know about that. So I don't believe everything he says, but I believe almost everything he says.
Sorry, you noticed I picked an actor on purpose because of what you were saying about skepticism.
Yeah.
If I'm going to believe anything they say, might as well be an actor.
Jack Black, I want to watch him do almost anything.
Yeah.
Like he has a YouTube channel,
Right.
Jablinski Games. Whenever that comes out, I have like on YouTube, I have that bell,
Oh, really?
So I get an email as soon as I come out. I'm like viewer 11 out of, I think he gets like 100 million views per video or some 10 million. I'm like right there because I'll watch Jack Black do anything. I love Tenacious D to death. I love his Tenacious D movies. I love his other movies, School of Rock,
Right.
Nacho Libre. I love all the just everything that guy does. I will watch him do anything. I want to please them and obey them without question. That's my old mentor, Paul David, and that he had a charisma to me, very personally. I guess similar to your sensei, where it was just like you just feel very compelled to follow them and please them. Right. I respect them and want to meet them and talk about stuff. That's Billie Eilish. She seems like a very interesting person to me. I can very much relate to her. She, do you know who Billie Eilish is?
Yeah.
Yeah. She's a teenager, started off just recording at home,
Right.
and was kind of a alternative person, right? Alternative kid.
Yeah.
Lived an alternative kind of life, wasn't into the regular popular stuff, or at least doesn't appear so. She's really nerdy. Like she's a super nerd about The Office, the TV show. There's this YouTube video where Rainn Wilson, who plays Dwight Schrute, goes to her house and asks her all these really obscure trivia questions about The Office, and she knows everything about it.
I saw the thumbnail on YouTube. I didn't watch it because I had no context. I'm like, I heard of Billie Eilish, but I'm like, why would I watch a video of someone answering Office questions? Like,
it's crazy how she can. She it's like she watched it, 100 times. The season, and I was similar to that when I was in high school. I had my crappy recording equipment. I recorded my own music. If the internet existed in the 80s, I absolutely would have been posting to SoundCloud and sharing stuff. And I was not even 1% as talented as Billie Eilish was, but I definitely. And then now that she's famous, she's kind of retained her. She hasn't sold out. It doesn't appear. Like one of the things that she does is she wears very baggy clothes. Because a lot of those, young stars decide to wear very skin-tight clothes or no clothes at all, and that's fine. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But I'm sure that she was getting pressure to show more skin, and she doesn't show an ounce of skin. She dyes her hair kind of funky. She talks in a very authentic way. Like the stuff that comes out of her mouth, I'm sure she has a handler that's like can you tone it?
Say that.
Yeah, can you tone it down a little bit? Because, you appeal to 12-year-old girls, and if their moms hear you talking, they're not going to want to. And she probably was just like, "Fuck you, I'm me." You know what I mean? I'm not going to not be me.
What instrument does she play? An instrument?
She programs.
Okay.
She does. She programs the drums. She programs the bass and the keyboards, and she does all the overdubs. And I don't know her current. I'm sure she has producers helping her now, but back in the day when she was on SoundCloud, it was just her and her computer.
Oh, nice.
I'm guessing she plays the guitar, but I don't know. But anyway, she just seems like a very interesting person, and obviously she has charisma, and I feel very drawn to her on some level. For this episode, I'm going to analyze Jack Black as we go through charisma. Who do you want to analyze?
Oh, interesting. Then let's do Alec.
Most destructive charismatic person, like Hitler, Jim Jones, David Koresh, Charlie Manson. Who's your most destructive charismatic person?
Of the recent years, certainly Hitler.
Okay.
But actually, you could argue. You can make an argument around Stalin as well. So
okay, how about you do Hitler? And so you're going to do Hitler and Alec Baldwin, and I'm going to do Charlie Manson.
Okay.
Final question here, Berto. Before we go into the next section, are we charismatic?
Oh yeah, I mean certainly. I think that something that I've always felt about myself is that I have some ability that is a little beyond maybe the mean or something, to be interesting in a group and to be interesting, maybe stand out a little bit. Sometimes especially when I was younger, I couldn't invoke that at will, and it wouldn't work on every kind of grouping. It still doesn't, of course. There's people that will definitely not be into my brand or your brand of interestingness. But certainly, if there is any sort of thing happening, a group meeting, an event, or whatever, I have found throughout my life that I am fairly capable of being, charismatic among that thing. And then we've demonstrated via the podcast that apparently we have some level of interest to a group of people out there. I wouldn't say we're as charismatic as Hitler, but
right. So let's also analyze us as potential charismatic people. Maybe we have charisma, maybe we don't, but I think that would be interesting because it brings it down to earth on some level. We can also talk to our own internal process as to whether or not we're trying to be charismatic or something. What are we doing on purpose? What are we doing without thinking about it? What traits do we have that lead us to be either charismatic or uncharismatic? So in today's episode, we're going to dive into, this is just the introduction, by the way. We're going to dive into the history of charisma in going back to the ancient Greeks. We're going to go over the definitions, because actually that's a big topic that you have to define. Like, how do we how do we define in linguistics charisma? How do we define it in the clinical literature, which I'll get into? What are the different types of charisma, which we've kind of gone into already? Do you and I possess charismatic qualities? How can one be charismatic? Because a lot of people have that question. How
can it be more charismatic?
Yeah, in my personal life.
Right.
What happens when you have too much charisma? Because you can. What are the theories of charisma? Because I didn't realize this, but there's a ton of theoretical literature on overall models of charisma and how it emerges in individuals and in society, including evolutionary psychology, which we're going to get into.
Nice.
Which I actually kind of appreciate this angle, which I didn't think I would. We're also going to look at the research. And up until this point, we've been talking about charisma without a basis of definition, without the scientific literature. But I want to get into all that. And when I first started to prep for this episode, I thought, give it 3 hours. This has been a month of me actually.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there's that much.
Well, because the more I got into it, I was like, man, I don't think I can do it justice unless I really kind of systematically start going through all the everything that's ever been written on it. And so this episode represents that. This is the Psychology of Seattle podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I make analog cell phones.
This is the analog cell phone. Can you imagine? How would that work?
I don't have to imagine. I make them.
Yeah.
They have vacuum tubes, and so they have that nice analog sound to them.
Okay.
Yeah. They get a little warm. It's the only thing.
Yeah, and large.
They are large.
Yeah. this episode is just for patrons of the podcast. So if you're not a patron of the podcast, this episode is going to end before the next 2 hours of the episode.
But you got a lot of good free content already.
Yeah. Of us speculating about various different things. So if you want to listen to this full episode and you're not a patron, become a patron by going to patreon.com. Berto, if a charismatic person said, who was your bad person? Hitler?
No, let's not do it.
Okay, Alec Baldwin. If Alec Baldwin was to compel the listeners to become a patron, how would he do it?
Listen to me. I'm going to only say this once, but this is the most important thing you will ever have heard in your lives. You have a once in a billion universes opportunity to donate and support the single most important thing in humanity and in history, the Psychology in Seattle podcast. This is your opportunity. If I don't see you join up, I'm coming to your house. I'm going to look you straight in the eye, and you're going to have to answer to me.
ABP, always be a patron.